just to start by introducing the companies in play here, Clearview have been a well-established organisation providing software and consultancy services, particularly around their software products of strategic planning, performance and risk management, and data and customer analytics solutions. And we've been doing that for over 15 years. We're ISO 9001 and 27001 certificated. And in conjunction with our partners on the call today, Infoboss and iComply 365, we're now offering a cloud data migration solution service in a variety of guises, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Infoboss, one of our partners, is a software business that provides software and consultancy services around a tool set that can be extremely useful for supporting migration projects. In particular, the intuitive search-based interface to the data discovery capabilities within the product make it particularly relevant for organizations with a large amount of unstructured data, which generally is the case for people looking to migrate to the cloud. And I'll also be introducing my colleague from iComply 365, Mark Adams, who has extensive experience, over 15 years of helping organizations migrate to the Microsoft cloud environment. And he'll be talking in depth around the process, the planning, and what's involved in a successful migration. So what we're going to cover is I'm going to hand over in a second to Mark, and he's going to give us an introduction to cloud data migration and why what we're proposing is a smarter way of doing this. And he'll be touching on the business benefits in that initial part of his session, and looking in a bit more detail at the Microsoft cloud environment and how that can help further down the line. Then I'll be taking over the session again, and I'll be taking you through the Infoboss product, a bit more detail around how you can use that for managing your unstructured data estate. And then I'll hand back over to Mark, and he'll talk through the planning process, the core principles of the cloud data migration project, looking at how the target Microsoft environment can be configured, and also taking you on a step-by-step journey through a proposed migration. And then we'll finish off with a summary and then give you the opportunity to ask some questions. In terms of the questions, when you're ready to do that, if you've got any questions to raise, if you could use the chat facility, because everybody's on mute at the moment, and I will unmute you to enable you to ask your question, or you can just pose the question through the chat facility if you prefer to do it that way. So I will now hand over to Mark, who's going to talk us through the next stage of cloud migrations. Over to you, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Right, what I'd like to cover first is why you should consider a smart data migration, really. Obviously, you've built up over time masses of information, but if you've been keeping that in Fileshares, much of it's been in silos and not available to everyone. So we need to really look at what's the outcomes of a migration like this and what benefits you should see. Well, the first thing really comes down to the fact that Office 365 has got a very nice enterprise search platform. And because it will have indexed all of the information that's brought into the new world, it's now going to be much more findable. It's also going to be securely trimmed, so you can make sure that people can only find the stuff that you want to. But at the end of the day, all of your content is going to be much more findable. As long as you've cleaned up your content before you migrate it to the cloud, you can also make sure that the information they find is of much more consistent quality, and also is honed at the people you want to use certain types of information, so you can target information nicely. Because of improved security trimming and improved quality, you can start to widen the audience for your content. Therefore, your content is going to have more usability across your organization, or even outside your organization as well. And also, it's worth saying at this stage is that the search environment in 365 is a universal one. So it's across your email platform, it's across all of your areas where you can store your new content. And it can even include things outside of your business as well. Content at the moment probably means it's in your file shares. But in fact, really, ideally, you want that information to be where people want to use it and in the workplace that's most optimized for what they're doing. And in Office 365, you've now got new storage areas, SharePoint and OneDrive for Business, which are sort of equivalents of some of the file share environments you've got, but with much enhanced capabilities. But you've also got workspaces that include places where you can store content and manage content, like Teams and Planner and lots of others. So it's also worthwhile considering how your people can work better in the new world. The other thing is that we've now really got facilities for them and you as an organization to manage this content. You know, how old is it? When should it be reviewed by somebody? Who's authorizing its publishing? And so you've got all this rich content lifecycle management built in. You don't have to really configure it. It's there ready to be used. So they're sort of end user benefits, if you like, and that can add a lot to productivity. On the management side of things is that storage in the cloud, even very sophisticated storage in layers, is very inexpensive. So you can immediately save storage costs. So that's a very big saving. It's also, it has features and abilities that we'll talk about later that enable you to manage that content. So you're managing your risk of the wrong content falling into the wrong hands. Again, as I mentioned on the user side of things, you can now embed lifecycle management to that content. So you can now control it in a very granular fashion. Microsoft has also spent a lot of thought and time looking at how people should manage this environment. So they've created very nice management consoles that you can designate people with new responsibilities to really stay on top of how your content is being used, how it's adding value to your organization. And you can do that on a local basis, on a global basis. And you can even adopt multiple standards if you're operating in multiple countries. Another feature of Office 365 is they've put the infrastructure in place on a global basis. So you've got no capital expenditure to the actual entry cost for this platform in the pricing tables is very low. And therefore you should expect a very high return on investment. And again, because of the management consoles and the automation, it actually should be a very low cost environment to continue to manage going forward. So what we're going to discuss today is the ability to use external tooling and inbuilt tooling into Office 365 to get legacy content into Office 365, or indeed move content across Office 365 and multiple clouds in order to reuse it and reorganize it in a way that suits the way you want to work with this content. So we're going to talk about classifying and cleansing. We're going to talk about tagging, so we can use those tags to apply functionality. We're going to talk about configuring the cloud environment so that it automates the content in a way that you want it to automate the content as the content arrives. So lowering your cost of ownership and also improving how that content is utilized. And then also, it's not a one-time exercise. This is, you want to keep lifecycle managing all of your content, and it's to show you how that can be provided on an ongoing basis. This is a Microsoft slide, which has been tiny little bit changed. We've just introduced the Infoboss into the bottom of this range, and we've actually also then added the enrich migration phase. But what we're talking about here is sophisticated preparation of your content so that as it's migrated into Office 365, all of the standard functionality like policies, classification, labeling, protection, and monitoring and logging services just turn on and start to manage your content as things progress. So just to sort of give you a sort of visibility of some of the things that are actually up there in the cloud that we're going to utilize from these techniques. So I'm just going to hand back now to Mark, and he's going to walk you through some of the ways in which we use Infoboss. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. I'll just make myself the presenter. I'll just share my screen again, so hopefully you can all see the Infoboss slide on the screen. Okay, Infoboss, yeah, it's a fairly new toolkit, but it's been specifically designed to help organizations democratize their data, enabling users within the organization to get access to data that they understand and control to some extent, and enabling them to identify what that is, identify relevance for that data and value going forwards. And it feeds into what Mark's been talking about in terms of the information lifecycle management capabilities by, as I say, by democratizing that data, giving it to the people who've got control and can make best use of that data within the organization. So Infoboss is a platform, and it can derive data from any data source, and that can be document stores, which are typically unstructured data estates, social media applications, which again contain a large amount of unstructured data. It can also pull in data from email systems, be they existing Office 365 environments or Microsoft Exchange environments. Again, you might be wanting to do some cleansing or minimization of that data estate before you migrate that to an Office 365 environment. It can work across databases, and this is particularly useful where you've got data that you know about, for example, in a CRM system or a customer management system, where you trust that data, and you may want to use elements of that data to help you understand better your unstructured data estate. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the Infoboss presentation. It can also process sort of semi-structured files like spreadsheets and interpret those as column-based data sets that can be analyzed. The tool itself sits on top of the Elastic technology, and this is a very scalable, robust, and secure technology. It's used by the likes of NASA. Netflix use it, Uber use it. So every time you've ever been in an Uber, the data that's being collected is being stored in an Elastic environment. So as you can imagine, it's massively scalable technology, and Infoboss sort of sits around it and helps you take advantage of that technology stack. What we have built within Infoboss is some very powerful tooling to help with unstructured data in particular. We use a combination of regex pattern matching, so we can find things like personal information like postcodes and passport numbers, driver license numbers, text, any patterns that match a particular format, for example, payment cards, bank account numbers, bank sort codes, and the like. And this becomes very, very useful when you're trying to understand what you have in the data set. It will also work across image files that contain text, so you can apply an OCR layer on top of the basic text search to convert any text that it finds within images and makes them available for searching as well. And that can be particularly useful for processing large volumes of images. The tool itself can also be used to democratize your data because of its powerful, intuitive, search-based concept for engaging with the data. And I'll show you that as we go into a little bit of a demonstration in a short while. And we have a variety of deployment options available to us, either on-premise, private cloud, or as a SaaS-based deployment model, depending on what suits the client. So if we look at unstructured data, because this is probably the biggest issue organizations face when they're looking at doing a data migration. They have a lot of unstructured data, and to be fair, they probably don't know that much about what the value of that data is within their organization. And one of the challenges with somebody recently described it as the mother of all headaches, and I think that anybody on this call would probably echo that's got the task of migrating this data to the cloud. And I think one of the challenges with it is it's just the sheer volume of it and the inability to keep up with the collection, storage, and management of it going forwards. Now, bear in mind that what we have in terms of unstructured data today is likely to grow exponentially over the next 3 to 5 years. IDC did some research a couple of years back, and they predicted 163 zettabytes of data globally would be processed by 2025, and 80% of that would be unstructured. There was some more research just published recently that suggested that 93% of global data in just 2020 will be unstructured. So the indications are that this data is growing, and the sources of that data is quite interesting, because up until now we've seen a lot of unstructured data in things like comment fields in documents. We've started to see a growth of video and voice recording, particularly within call centers and CCTV, a lot of images, scanned files. And then you've also got the Internet of Things, which is probably going to account for the vast majority of unstructured data going forward. And the ability to make sense of this data and relevance of this data is crucial to success. And one of the challenges with it is it doesn't have any specific format, so it doesn't sit well with traditional database models and tooling. And as a consequence of that, it's difficult to know what you've got, who's got access to it, and what the value of that is. And add to that the GDPR risk of cyber breach data leakage, where over 50% of that is caused by insiders. There's a good chance that this data is not only difficult to manage, but it's also potentially a big risk to the organization. But it has significant value, and it can be used to inform business product, customer and service delivery if you can establish the relevance. And that's really where the space that Infoboss seeks to populate, is to help you understand what value you have within your unstructured data estate. So I've just sort of thrown up here some scenarios that you might challenge yourself with. You might be looking for all correspondence with non-contracted customers. So this could potentially be data that you no longer need, and you'd want to be able to eliminate that. You could be looking for any, and there's a recent example, one of our clients had a folder full of images, and it turns out that the lion's share of these contain site plans, and every single site plan has the word site plan in it, in the image, and we were able to identify that through the OCR process. So thus saving and adding some value to that data. It may be that you've got a document set that contains customer references. This is very useful for identifying data for data subject access requests and the relevance of data. It may be that those customers references that it relates to are no longer customers, in which case the data could be potentially removed. Looking for, if you're seeking to be PCI DSS compliant, you certainly will want to make sure that you understand where you're storing any payment card details. But how often do you get situations where payment card details are inadvertently entered into an email address or stored in a document, corresponded in a letter, and then saved somewhere in a shared folder? Downloads of spreadsheets that contain employee or customer details that are just saved in a temporary folder. Being able to find those is really, really useful. Spreadsheets that contain monetary amounts, they could be employee salary details, or they could be financial statements that you don't want to be shared in public areas. The basic things like for basic personal identifiable information, such as postcodes, driver license numbers, NHS numbers, phone numbers, and so on and so forth. It may be just something as simple as identifying all cases where you've got .exe files, MP3 files, MP4 files, backup files, .pst files, .zip files that have been downloaded and just left around the data estate that are no longer relevant. And you certainly won't want to be migrating those files to the cloud. Similarly, how often have you had a staff presentation given by the CEO that's shared in email? People download it, save it, and it could be a 10, 20 megabyte file that's manifested itself hundreds of times across the organization. So what Infoboss enables you to do is automatically classify the data as it's ingested. So we will index the data, and then we'll start to apply rules using the regular expression technique initially, and then we'll start to build up whitelists and blacklists. So a whitelist could be all active customers. So we're interested in identifying all data related to active customers. Similarly, we're interested in identifying against the blacklist of customers that have perhaps said they no longer wish for us to store their information, in which case we'll be seeking to minimize that to comply with GDPR. We can also be able to derive data from unstructured data, and I'll show you this when we get into the demonstration. So where you've got key fields within a document, you may be able to extract that out and identify it. And that could be, for example, a customer reference or a date or some other significant piece of information that enables you to tie it to a business process. The key thing about all of this is that Infoboss can then be used to export the lists of data that you've identified and tag it with additional labels and metadata that you can then use to feed the migration tools that Mark's going to talk about and support the labeling once the data arrives in the Microsoft environment. So without any more ado, I'm going to jump into a demonstration. Hopefully you can see the screen there now. Just go. Probably will have timed me out. Yes. So I'm just going to log in to an environment, and I'm set up as an administrator in this environment, which gives me more rights than a normal user would have. But it enables me just to show you some of the features, and I'll quickly cover these off. So as an administrator, I get to see the data inventory box on the left, and you'll see it's got 22 indexes. That basically means there are 22 data sets. It could be document stores, email systems, CSV files, databases that contain data that we've indexed within the system. I can then make these data sets available through the use of projects. So I've created a number of projects here containing different versions of the data sets. I'm going to start with the company one, which is a fairly classic situation. So I've got a customer CRM database. I've got a customer services email box. I've got a couple of very interesting data sets, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. And I've got some document folders that contain correspondence with customers. That's largely unstructured data. I've got a CSV file I've processed there. I've got some contract data over there. And I've also got a collection of image files that contain, some of which contain some text information, which I may be able to use the OCR facility on later. But I'm going to start with just looking at the structured data for customers. And the interface you're going to see here is very similar to any data set. It doesn't really matter what the data set is. It will always be displayed in this tabular way. So I've got column headings for the various pieces of data that I have. One of the things that we are doing behind the scenes is applying this classification rules. It's not so relevant for the structured data, and I'll come on to that more when we look at some unstructured data. But you can apply the rules, and it's looking at the data, trying to find certain things. We've also tagged certain fields in here to be in a different color to indicate that they're personal and sensitive information. But one of the things I might be interested in doing is just using it to find things. So somebody called Weekly, for example. So I can just run that search as you would do a Google search, but it's going across your data. And I've identified 29 cases where this person called Weekly occurs in the data set. Some other nice things I might be able to do in here, I certainly will want to do for demonstration purposes here, is I've got this active field here. If I just click on the at the top, it's identified that we've got 2,242 active contracts and 258 inactive ones. So if I just apply that that immediately now gives me a list of 258 contracts that are inactive. And I can save that. And I have done previously, and I'll show you how I've used that data in a second. But you'll see this is going to have ID information in it, as names and postcodes and so on and so forth, and reference numbers and the likes. And that'll become useful later. I can also use this this filtered data set now. I've also got another field in here, which is age. So I might want to just add to this data set by saying I'm only interested in child data that's inactive. So I shouldn't really be processing this data. So this is data that's relating to children that we haven't got consent through an active contract to be processing. And again, I can save that as a query and use that data elsewhere. And I've done that somewhere else. The other way you can use the system as well is to visually look at the data over a timeline. So this is particularly interesting from a data retention point of view. You can see I've got data going back to 1994. So there's a good chance I've probably got data in here that is beyond its retention period, and I might want to process that. And I can just click on any of these column values and it'll give me an extract of that data that's relevant to that particular item. Okay, so if I now take a look at some of the unstructured data and see how I've used that data. So you'll notice I had an inactive customers query, which I've saved and created a list of here. And I also had the child data with no consent, which I've saved over here. Now I've used these within this data set here. So I've now got 2,500 documents relating to correspondence with customers. Now it's going to, most organizations are going to have a lot more than this, but for the purposes of this example, just to even look through 2,500 documents, you're probably looking at several days worth of work. But I very quickly want to identify, using my classifiers, any of this data that relates to out of contract customers. So that list I saved earlier, I'm now able to apply that and immediately filter out and identify documents that relate to customers that are out of contract. So these are probably candidates that I could remove or archive, and I can just simply use the a combination of the little cog up here, and that enables me to identify the fields. And one of the fields in here, which is particularly relevant for the data migration, is the file name. But I can also associate the classifiers and any of the derived data that's come out of that, which could form the basis of other labels in the migration tool. And I can just simply export that out as a CSV file, which would then be a feed into the migration tools, which Mark will talk a little bit more about later. In a similar way that I've used the classifiers for identifying out of contract data, I can also use it to identify the child data. So this is certainly data that I should not be processing or have available in a document store that other people could potentially access. So that'd be something I would want to feed off again, using the file name, and then perhaps feed that into a PowerShell script to go and remove that data from the data state, thus minimizing it ahead of a migration. You'll also notice, because I've been able to derive data out of the unstructured data sets, so I can even look at things like, how the letters have been written in terms of the salutation. And you'll notice that I've got two instances here that haven't used dear as the salutation in the letter, and you can see from this that they use the informal hello or hi, and that should really be clamped down on, and it's somebody called Nick Williams that's been doing that, so we need to have a word with him and correct his behavior. We also have identified postcodes and customer references. So again, customer references could be a significant thing to capture, and we know all of our customer references begin with a W and then have a 6-digit number that follows it. So I've been able to identify lots of instances where there aren't any customer references, so I can apply that. So where customer references is equal none, I've got 19 letters here that don't have customer references in them. And again, I can export these lists out as need be. Well, I was going to just jump into the image data. So as you can see, there's 341 image files in here. And where it's not been able to apply an OCR scan, it comes up with the word document is either empty, contains images, or is a scanned document. So if I just put the word empty in there, it's identified 248 matches, and I can just add that clause as a query. And just by clicking on it, I can negate that. So that now gives me all of the documents, or so all the image files that we've been able to identify some text from. And you'll see some of them have got gibberish in them, but some of them do contain some recognizable words. So one of the things that the tool has enabled me to do is I can do fuzzy searches. So I can do anything that relates to restaurant. And you can see it's made 5 matches there. And one of them, it's identified this restaurant, and then it's an apostrophe. And I can also then just look at that file, so we can just see what it actually has in it. So I just click on that, see the file. Let's open it up over on my other screen, which I'll just bring over. You can see it's picked up the text 94 Stuart, and the reason it didn't get the T, you'll notice it's faded out, but it has got like a highlight there, an apostrophe, so it's actually picked up the restaurant bit, but just not being able to get the T because of that. And that could be quite useful. As I say, one of our clients recently used this technique to identify site plans related to properties that they owned of several thousand image files, and we're able to identify all the ones that were site plans using this technique. So save quite a lot of time rather than having to open up each individual file to be able to identify them in that way. The other way the system could be used is to identify junk data. So if I've got a mashup index here of lots of document files, and one of the things that we've got in here is a document extension. I haven't got that many variety of documents in here, but you can imagine you would have .pst, .mp3, .zip files, pings, exe files, and so on and so forth. And being able to just identify, well, tell me all the PDFs, .texts, and .x's, apply that filter, and immediately identify those. And it may be that we've made a decision, any .exe files, we're not going to migrate, we're just going to delete them. And then you can just feed that again out to a CSV file and populate your data removal process with that data set. Okay, so that concludes my very brief demonstration of Infoboss, and I'm now going to hand back over to Mark to complete the presentation.
Plan for compliant content lifecycle management. Everybody see that?
Yeah, that's good, Mark.
Great, that's good. Okay. Just to emphasize what Mark's been talking about there is that migration, particularly smart migrations, are really reliant on the content, the people who use and create the content in the legacy world to really add metadata to the migration process. And it's bringing that information and classifications across that really allows us to target rules in a very accurate way to the content in the new world. So a bit of work and careful planning in that area makes a huge difference to the quality of a migration and the way in which you can use your legacy data in your new world. On the screen now is just a slide that shows the importance that Microsoft are really putting on the effort to think about your data as you're bringing it into the Office 365 and Azure world. So these are just some resources that are available to you to help you review content. To also consider the security of the content. Mark referred to information being brought in on children and employees, contracts. Really, you need to identify, for various reasons, general risk, but also things like GDPR compliance and CCPA, that how you are intending to protect this data and prove that you have protected that data. You also need to decide as well is if you're moving from an on-site environment to a new cloud environment, how you're going to re-protect that data that you're bringing in from an access point of view. So who's going to have access to it? If it leaves the business via email, are you going to use data loss protection to make sure that it can't be used in a way you didn't want it to be used once you've emailed it to someone? Just get rid of that. Also, we've got additional capabilities for finding sensitivity of content as it comes in, and also as we create it in the Office 365 environment. And I'll go on to talk about the security and compliance centers as we move through this presentation. I'll just click through. Right, let's talk about what we need to do in order to successfully migrate content from Fileshares. Well, first and foremost, it's a big project. If you take this seriously as a project, you need to make sure that you set up a project team, you get the relevant people on board from an organizational point of view to make the project a success. But you also get departmental resources aligned who know their own content and can provide the effort and the time to working on the classification of the information, also the cleaning out of the information. A huge chunk of legacy content tends to be made up of what we would call as rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial. More often than not, around 30 to 50% of your content could be cleaned out for the basis that it hasn't been used for a long time. You no longer have the applications that access the information, that it represents risk from a compliance point of view. And really, it's just not of a high enough value. It also hides all the high quality content because you're just looking for a pin in a very big haystack, and this should allow you to thin that haystack down to the usefulness of it. There are things that you need to remember as well, things you shouldn't migrate up into Office 365's, zip files, exe files. There's all sorts of files that really there's no point in uploading, and often Office 365 won't accept data because it does its own analysis as well of what's coming up. I also talked earlier on about the fact that you may want to store this information in a completely different way. You may want to tag it on the concept of departmental, which department created the information. And so when you're actually enriching the data set at the review period, you can actually add a metadata column called department, created by department, and that will make sure that that's always tagged with that content. Which is also a nice way of making it findable in the new world. And I talked also about the fact that you may want to migrate this into new workspaces like an intranet, like Teams, groups, document libraries. You may also want to convert the documents you're bringing over into records. So for instance, if you've got contracts being processed as normal files, well, you know, a contract after its die date, if you like, may actually legally should be turned into a record and stored in that way, or it should be destroyed in a permanent way. The other thing is it's quite a complicated exercise, and it's all about mass volumes of data, and therefore really it needs to have a methodology. It needs to have tooling, and it needs to have migration tools that just really simplify what is otherwise underneath quite a complex project. It's a technical project, so you need to consider the infrastructure. So if you're migrating this stuff into the cloud, you need to make sure that you've got the right network and bandwidth capabilities. And it's not necessarily just for the transfer, because it may well be that that you want to roll out the new way of dealing with content at a speed that's right for the business. So you may want to migrate the content safely when you've got time. You then might want to keep it up to date and synced with the legacy environment, so that when a file share is updated, it actually updates the cloud version of that, so that you can decide to migrate when you want in a timely way that suits your business. You also need to consider that you've got to have people that are on the receiving end, that are in the business every day and can show people the benefits of how they can consume the information. So you need champions out there. You need people to be able to show that a particular department has had a really good success with this migration and have learned a lot from this, and keep the motivation of the business, because you wanted to draw through the value for the users and draw through the value of compliance control or lower costs as well, as a project as a whole. And again, you want to set some standards by which people can manage this information, the business can manage this information, so that it becomes lower and lower cost, higher and higher quality, and you know, the return on investment is completely apparent. I'm just going to now have a walk through what we talk about as being labels. So I'm just going to drag on a part of the Office 365 environment. So some of you may have seen some of this, some of you may not, but this is, I'm in the Security Compliance Center, just one of the Office 365 dashboards. I'm in what's called the classifications area. So this is the area where we create labels, and I'll walk through now, but very quickly, well, no, we'll do labels first. So let me just go into the labels area, and you'll see on the screen, and a label is effectively a tag that we place on a record, either manually or automatically. And the tag actually provides a whole load of features that says that the label, or in some terms a location, has some properties by which the document is always treated. And so we've got a name for it. This is HR1, this is employee data. And for employee data, we may choose that we encrypt it or not. We may want that there's a watermark embedded into the content. We may want to say that if this content ever leaves the business via somebody sending a file or emailing some content, or in fact a piece of employee data is even just inside an email, we can actually apply endpoint data loss prevention, and this enables you to do that. And also is that as we generate labels, we can generate rules by which certain types of documents are found and treated in a very particular way. So this auto-labeling capability, it means that I can actually say, I can hunt for information in a document, and this in fact is a label that we can apply via the Infoboss system when we're doing the classification. So when we're doing the classification, we can find all of the employee information with the help of the subject matter experts on the content. We apply the label at the classification stage, and then this service sits and waits to see any documentation that's coming into the environment, and therefore if it finds that label, it will tag that label, and as soon as it's been ingested by Office 365, it will start processing that content in the way that it's already suggested. Let me just get rid of that. So we've got labels, and we've also got different types of labels. Notice that was called a sensitivity label. We've also got retention labels, which we can apply. And if I just go into this one, and you can see here, we can now start to say that this has a file plan, and it's saved into a certain environment under a certain classification, and also we can decide how long it will be stored for. So for GDPR type processes, this is a perfect way of patterning how each type of bucket of certain types of documents and content can be treated. And we can also then apply labels as well. So we can mix retention labels, sensitivity labels, and policies. So we can create a really rich set of controls that stay with the content throughout its life and manage it through its life. As you can see, none of this is rocket science. There are wizards that enable you to do this manually, or if you want to produce stuff on spreadsheets as a general overlay, you can import it via techniques with JSON or PowerShell as well, so that you can do this on bulk. And we talked about data loss protection. These are just different policies, and all these can be woven together into a rich fabric that decides on how every piece of content is treated, protects it in the way that you want to protect it, and we move through. Let me just check, let me just take that off the screen again. Just a quick look at labels. So I'll just now take you through, and let's just have a look at a bigger picture. Let me just bring that back onto the screen. And I think it's worthwhile that there's a lot of stuff in this environment up in Office 365 now. There's a real rich dashboard of automation, and the investment has been huge. So you can see we're in an area called classifications. You can see I've got widgets up here telling me how many labels. We've got the ability to create sensitive information types. Microsoft provide 80 or so information types that will find all of the common things like driving licenses and stuff like this. So an awful lot of stuff has been done for us. But going back to the scenario using Infoboss, we can also create our own what's called sensitive information types. And we pick these up as we migrate the information in. So by working in this area here and setting up, this almost is the definition of your own data. And if you get this definition set up properly, then you can decide exactly where and how you want to manage this data. And we've got data loss protection, we've got records management with file plans and dispositions and the ability to create records. We've got data governance rules and dashboards to actually show the status of where you are. These are all customizable. So what Microsoft have done here now is really simplify what is a very complex process. And it isn't rocket science. It doesn't take a lot to learn this stuff. Once you do it a little bit at a time with your own data, it starts to make a lot of sense. I'm just going to drop back now into here, just give me a second. And so what are we doing with Infoboss? We're scanning, we're indexing, we're discovering, and we're applying labels that we can then pick up in Office 365. We're making decisions on groups of like content, so that we actually, may have on projects that I've been looking at, there's anything between 30 to 100 different types of buckets of content that you just need to make rules on, and that can then be hundreds of documents or tens of thousands of documents sitting in those various types of buckets. A word you may not have heard of before, this information architecture. This is really goes back to what we talked about, that you've got a lot of new ways in which you can store and manage your content in the Office 365 environment. So you need to think about which storage structures, which applications you want to put them in, and so that you can sort of play, almost storyboard how you want your people to use this content, how it will make them more effective. And this planning of the information architecture is just understanding that in the new world, if you could do it differently, do it better, how are you going to do it? So just thinking the way through that. And then we apply the labels in order to actually make that happen, if you like. What Infoboss does for us then, as the migration process, it will simply output a set of columns that we can import as a CSV file. And there's a number of really good migration tools out there in the market that just actually simplify and automate the migration process. And Excel then can become a fantastic tool that can be used by anyone in your business, that they just manipulate a Excel spreadsheet template that is partly designed for them, or we can help you design those spreadsheets, or you sit down with the IT department and design the spreadsheets. Those spreadsheets are then manipulated by the people that know the content, and then they're given back to the migration person in order to use to set up a job to migrate the information from A to B. We have talked a lot about labeling in context of how you use it to manage the data going forward, but we can also do things like, I mentioned search earlier on. We can also actually import metadata that enables you to find your content by department, by product, by country. So we can really improve the experience of finding data as well. So all we do is we take the spreadsheet, we import the spreadsheet into the migration tool, and then we go through a step-by-step migration. And you can see here, this is actually a platform called ShareGate, but a number of other platforms support Excel spreadsheets, and you can see here that we've got a label called export to export metadata and import and copy. And all we're going to do here really is actually then just use the import and copy. We import a spreadsheet which holds all of the data about where it resides, what it's called, what tags we've applied to it, what are the automatic tags that show the last person that modified the document, how old the document is, so that when it comes into the new world, it's got all its legacy information associated to it. And then actually we just push a button and it's migrated into the Office 365 container. In this instance, it's a SharePoint document library, and it's auto-populated with the metadata. And within a few hours or a few days, subject to the amount of migrations that are going on, the Office 365 crawler, their search engine, will crawl across all of this information. It'll pick up the Infoboss label. It will then apply the Infoboss label to the techniques I showed you, looking at disposition or retention labels. And all of a sudden, the data is automatically managed on the basis of the rules that you've set up. Okay, so I'm just going through. So just recapping, some simple steps: scan the content, make some decisions, create a number of buckets, cleanse it, start to apply various types of labels to improve its lifecycle management or its findability, prepare the migration jobs in conjunction with the people that understand the content itself, push quality thought out Excel spreadsheets back to the migration team, and then run the migration process over and over and over and again. And initially you're looking at the technical process of migration. You're then looking at the finesse of department job by job. You solve the technical migration challenges with regard to pilots. You then start to refine the migrations in terms of usability and the lifecycle management. And then once you've got it trimmed exactly as you want it, you just keep the migration engine going until you're finished. It's pretty straightforward. So what you're then left with is a platform where you've done the discovery, you've applied the metadata, so the content is being managed. It's being protected as well by the policies that are associated to compliance and security by the secure score, store or compliance manager, etc. You can then, there are lots of reports that are there that run automatically, or you can create your own reports, and then you can start to refine that. So you've never stopped after you've migrated. It's really the start of the refinement of staying on top of your contents management cycles. And so where can we help? Well, we can help in the big picture of the migration planning. We can help with regard to adopting and utilizing the powerful tools that Infoboss can provide you. We can help you understand how to use labeling and classification and protection services in Office 365 to decide, how are you going to treat this information going forward. We can help you actually set up the jobs and set up the platform, or we can support you in terms of skill sharing and shadowing. We can provide this as a managed service, because sometimes, do you need to know how to migrate, or do you just want a quality migration job done so that it's in your new environment there ready for you to use and pick up? We can then help you manage it in terms of the new compliance capabilities, or particularly in GDPR, understanding the nuances of labeling and lifecycle management. Or we can just sit behind you as you do this yourselves, and just be there as a safe pair of hands when you come across problems or there's new stuff that you don't know about. So just handing over, Mark, I'll hand that back to you now for questions.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, if you could just pose them through the chat, and I'll give you voice access to the session. But equally, I've got a question mark really in terms of the tactics. You seem to be advocating a methodical approach here of establishing the target environment, configuring that correctly, and understanding what that needs to be, understanding your core data, minimizing that, and migrating it. And yet we see some people taking an approach of just lift and shift the whole lot. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, part of me is horrified by that approach, because you at some stage you've actually got to consider your information, or otherwise you're moving one pile of risk to another mess with the same pile of mix. But I have come across customers that have just been pressed by money and time, and maybe need to close legacy environments. Work with some big companies who are under pressure to close and minimize the number of data centers, and they had to do that within a time frame and a budget. So one thing to say is that the same techniques that we've been talking about, from migrating from a non-cloud environment into a cloud, can also be used with inside tenants, even inside just a single tenancy. So it can be used as a mass migration to get it into Office 365, and you do have some tools in Office 365 that do allow you to do some things better. But you can still use Databus, you can still use classification, you can still use labeling, and you can then do a second phase where you tidy up your cloud environment. And so it's not very bad. It's just a choice of where you want to spend your time, how your budgets are, where your skill sets are. So both are acceptable, but if you're going to really lift and shift, it's best not to take the rubbish with you.
Good answer. Okay, I think we'll just run a little bit over, so if there aren't any more questions, then we'll close the session here. Thanks very much, Mark, and to all the attendees that were on the session today. And I'll be in touch over the next week or so with each of you to see if we can help in some capacity. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.